Hello, lower six politicians. I hope you're all well. Go and wash your hands immediately and then come back and clap for Boris. As you can tell, I've got a microphone, which is a bit of a game changer. The plan is that I will work through lessons with you, and when I've said something which requires a bit of digestion or you think that you need a break, you just press pause wherever required. If we get to a point where in class I'd have said something like, take 2 minutes now to discuss something, what I'll do is I'll use a phrase like pause and when you hear that, you pause for however long I've specified and carry out whatever task I've specified. I won't be able to see whether you've done this or not, of course, but it could be fun. I think for me, it's a bit like being God, although without ever getting to actually see the results. Pause for 15 seconds and reflect on whether God would want to see the results of what he ordered. That was just a practice. It's not philosophy and ethics, it's politics. But that's the general premise. When you hear me say pause for or pause and, just do that. I'm taking it on trust. Before we begin today, just a little bit of housekeeping. Several of you still need to send me the essay on whether the UK is an elective dictatorship, so please do so as soon as possible. If you think you sent it to me, the easy way to check, apart from being a sensible human being and looking in your sent folder, is that I will have replied to it. So if you can't be bothered to find your sent folder because it's just too much work to move there from the inbox, you could maybe look in your inbox and see if I've said thank you or words to that effect. Okay. Secondly, this is a little bit better than it was towards the end of last term because I can at least talk to you. But, I can't hear you, so we've got some problems. If there's any vagueness or ambiguity either in what happens now, today, or in the future, or from the end of last term, please can you email me with a very specific sort of, this is the bit I want you to go over, and what I will do is I will address that from the start of the lesson after I get the email. Okay, so today, as you can see on screen, we are going to be looking at sovereignty within the UK. You've all heard the phrase parliamentary sovereignty before, and we are going to be looking at it today in the light of the European Union, amongst other things. I would like you now to pause for 30 seconds-ish and attempt to recall what is meant by the phrase parliamentary sovereignty. Assuming you've done that, because I didn't wait for 30 seconds, assuming you've done that and you've done it accurately, you will hopefully recall that parliamentary sovereignty is the general concept of Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, being the sole legitimate lawmaking body in the UK, although you might not have worded it exactly like that. Great. Okay, well done. Good. That's parliamentary sovereignty. But we want to take a step back from that and we want to say, what is sovereignty? So I want you to pause for 1 to 2 minutes, or indeed however long you're willing to give it, to speculate what might be meant by the term sovereignty. Okay, I'm sure you probably got this right, but sovereignty basically means having the ultimate authority to make decisions. So parliamentary sovereignty is simply a way of saying that the ultimate authority to make political decisions rests with Parliament. But what people find confusing is that in the UK, there are actually two types of sovereignty. There's legal sovereignty and there's political sovereignty. Parliament has only got one of these. Pause me for a few moments and guess, or better, actually think about and try and logically ascertain whether you think Parliament has got legal sovereignty or political sovereignty. Okay, well, obviously I don't know what you said, but if I were approaching this completely new, I would think from the name that Parliament had political sovereignty, but actually it doesn't. It has legal sovereignty. And what this means is three things, really. Legal sovereignty gives Parliament three sort of important features. Firstly, it means that Parliament and Parliament alone can make laws that are legally binding. You and I, for instance, cannot make laws that are legally binding. We can have sort of rules and guidelines for our lives, but we can't impose them on other people and expect them to be followed. And if we try and people break these laws that we are passing, we can't then punish them legally for doing so. Even organizations like the GLA or Holyrood can only make laws because Parliament allows them to. That's the first aspect of legal sovereignty. Secondly, Parliament having legal sovereignty means that there is no area of life where Parliament cannot legislate. One of the upsides, I suppose, of coronavirus is that we've recently seen lots of examples about this. The government has passed laws about, well, pause for a few moments. Consider what areas of life has the government recently passed laws about. Okay, the obvious ones would have been social distancing, lockdown, and the supply chain for food in supermarkets and so on. Parliament didn't pass laws about how much food you could buy or what types of, how many bags of pasta you could buy. Supermarkets did do that. But Parliament, because it was because it has legal sovereignty, could have passed a law saying, you can only buy 3 bags of flour or whatever it happens to be. There is nothing which can put a legal impediment in the way of Parliament legislating. Another thing is we don't have a codified constitution, of course, so it's not like in America where they can say, actually, the president doesn't have that power. Anyway, that's the second part of legal sovereignty, the idea that Parliament can legislate over any area. And the third part of legal sovereignty is that Parliament now cannot bind future parliaments. So, for instance, the current Parliament has taken us out of the European Union. And unless something very dramatic happens, the current Parliament will also take us out of the transition period. However, a future government might say, you know what, we want to go back in. And they can. You can't say, well, hang on a minute. The governments of May and Johnson orchestrated the departure of Britain from the European Union. You can't go back in. Because Parliament is sovereignty, it means the Parliament of that moment is sovereign. So if Boris wakes up tomorrow and he's had this incredible dream in which European unity is the way forward and he wants us to go back in, he can do that. And all he needs to do is change things within Parliament. You can't say, well, Parliament said this once and therefore it binds it forever. So that's your third part of Parliament, of legal sovereignty. The other type of parliamentary, or the other type of sovereignty is political sovereignty. Political sovereignty does not rest with Parliament. So pause for a short space of time and think, where might political sovereignty lie? Okay, obviously I don't know what you said, but the correct answer is that political sovereignty rests with the people, or more specifically, the electorate. Pure political power rests with the population, but they delegate this power to Parliament because it would be clearly impractical for the UK to attempt to govern itself through direct democracy. Even if you take out those people who aren't interested and can't vote and all the rest of it, you've still got tens of millions of people casting a vote, and there is no way that consensus could be found. So they delegate political power to Parliament. So they give Parliament legal sovereignty. They're saying Parliament is legally allowed to govern in the name of the people. Okay. So political sovereignty rests with the people, but they immediately delegate that to Parliament, which gives Parliament legal sovereignty. Okay, what this all means, if you put it together, is that Parliament is accountable to the people, which I'm sure isn't news to any of you, but that's the sort of theory behind it. Because the people are sovereignty and they delegate that to Parliament, that means that Parliament is accountable to the people. Great, easy peasy so far. And what this means is that every 5 years, at least, there's got to be a general election, Parliament seeks a new mandate, and so on. So we have this distinction between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty, but we also have, because of this, a distinction between power and authority. Now, Parliament is the group with authority, but people have power. So Parliament has the right to tell people to do things, but people have the power to force Parliament to do what they say. Just to dwell on this for a moment, the most obvious way in which Parliament is forced to do what the people say is at a general election. So parties are voted for and they're returned to Parliament on the back of a popular vote for their manifesto, and they are then required to try to implement that manifesto. If they don't, they will be removed, through the ballot box. But you can exercise power in other ways too. It's not just general election. If you look over the last 10 years, the government's not really had a great deal of time, let's say, for the NHS. But in the last 3-4 weeks, nursing homes and the NHS have suddenly become really, really very important. Austerity is gone. Pay freezes in the public sector are inconceivable now. For the last 10 years, there's been a large number of pay freezes in the public sector and inflation-linked pay rises for MPs. But that's now changing. There's also been austerity for 10 years and a lack of funding. And then you had the Chancellor stand up just last month and say, whatever the NHS needs, it will get. Okay, I mean, it took a pandemic to do it, but more significantly and probably more politically relevant than that, it wasn't actually the pandemic, it was public opinion. If the Chancellor had stood up and said, well, okay, there's a pandemic, but I don't really see why that's a problem. Why doesn't the NHS act accordingly and be much better with its money, which is basically what they'd said for the previous 10 years, then they'd probably have been risking their lives and not because of a coronavirus. That, violence against MPs might well have stepped up. So the public mood, essentially, is the power that people have to change the way in which Parliament acts. So we can see that there are different ways in which the people can exercise power. Okay, phew, wonderful. Right, that's what sovereignty is. I've got no idea how long that took because I don't have a timer, but long enough, I think. I'm assuming you're pausing as we go, by the way, but if not, you might want to pause now and just have a break because that was full on. Okay, next question. Where does sovereignty reside in the UK's political system? Well, the short answer is it resides in Parliament, but that is an answer which ignores a lot of the nuances about the way the system works. You've recently, hopefully, completed an essay on whether the UK is an elective dictatorship, and essentially any large part of Parliament can be overruled by one small part of Parliament, which is the executive. The reality is that the executive can almost always force their way. So the reality is that sovereignty within the UK system largely rests with the executive. The executive will usually win the support of the legislative because by nature, governing party MPs outnumber non-governing party MPs. The executive can also overrule the Lords, as you know, using the Parliament Act, or it can use the royal prerogative and just say that it's not for Parliament to discuss this matter. As we saw last term, it's true that the Supreme Court could challenge Parliament by saying Parliament has acted ultra vires, but the Supreme Court only exists in and of itself through an act of Parliament. And that could, in an extreme situation, actually be repealed. And even if the Supreme Court does say that Parliament can't do something, Parliament can then change the laws to make it so actually they can. So the whole premise that sovereignty rests, within the red benches and the green benches and the tall chairs that judges sit on and all the rest of it is slightly flawed. Sovereignty, in theory, does that, but the reality is it rests largely with the executive. Despite the apparently unquestionable sovereignty of the executive specifically and of Parliament as a whole, though, you do need to be aware that there are certain arguments to suggest that, in fact, parliamentary sovereignty isn't absolute. And that's where we're going to bring out the old favourite, the spider diagram. Oh, yeah. It's going to have 4 legs, which I know doesn't make it a spider, but it's 2-dimensional, this, isn't it? So, like, the other 4 legs could be behind the other legs. I don't know, you guys can work this out. Okay, pretty sure spiders have 8 legs, though. Right, so the first argument against parliamentary sovereignty is that certain parts of the UK, most notably Scotland, but obviously also Wales, Northern Ireland, and London, have devolved power, which shows that the Westminster Parliament cannot be the sole lawmaking body for those areas. The counter-argument, though, is that these devolved institutions only exist in the first place because of an Act of Parliament. So it's quite legitimate for the UK Parliament to repeal that Act. It can abolish the GLA, it can abolish the Welsh Assembly or whatever, simply by repealing the relevant Act. And this suggests that these bodies are not actually effective challenges to parliamentary sovereignty. The counter-argument, though, is in what universe, in what set of circumstances, is there ever going to be a government which is going to say, we are abolishing the Scottish Parliament? It would surely be political suicide. Staggeringly unpopular. It would lose them so many votes. And then the counter-argument is, yeah, but we used to say that about leaving the European Union, and look where we are now. The next challenge to parliamentary sovereignty, neatly tailing on from the European Union there, is the use of referendums or referenda. Most members of Parliament, before the Brexit referendum was held, were in favour of remaining in the European Union. but the people as a whole narrowly voted to leave the European Union. So Parliament had to do it. And therefore, that is surely proof that referendums can challenge parliamentary sovereignty. Yes and no. The counter-argument is pretty straightforward. Referendums are not legally binding. They are simply large-scale opinion polls. And as such, Parliament is not obliged to implement whatever is indicated as the preferred course of action. And then we have political reality kicking in again, though. Which government is going to hold a referendum, it's an honest referendum, have the referendum, count all the votes, and say, yep, well, you guys clearly want us to do option A, but you know what? We're going to do option B because fundamentally you are a bunch of idiots, you're wrong, and we're not going to listen to you. We would have done if you had voted the right thing, but you didn't. Admittedly, this doesn't sound like anything any Parliament or MP is ever going to say, but if you do have a bit of time on your hands, look at this for high-tech stuff. What you want to do is you want to look for the work of a guy called Edmund Burke, who hopefully had better handwriting than that. Gone, but there you go, Edmund Burke. And he wrote this thing called The Address to the Electors of Bristol, in which he basically argues that he's an MP because he's clever and everyone else is stupid, so they should just let him get on with it. And if they don't like it, they can vote him out. He did write it in 1774, but a lot of it holds true. Thirdly, there's a piece of legislation in Parliament, of course, called the Human Rights Act. And the Human Rights Act imposes limits on parliamentary sovereignty, it is argued, by saying this is what Parliament can and cannot do, and this is what Parliament has to respect, and so on. However, this is easy to dismiss. It is an act of Parliament. It has exactly as much legal basis as, take a couple of really mundane examples, the 1996 Treasure Act, the 1964 Libraries Act. Okay, it is just a piece of statute law, and as such can be amended or even repealed when it is politically what should we say, right to do so? No, probably not right for the human rights, but you know what I mean, when it is politically necessary or desirable to do so. So that's not really an argument. Furthermore, even if the judges find the government to be in breach of the law, they can't force the government to change the law. The government can say, thanks, that's a really interesting interpretation, and completely ignore it. Again, political reality suggests they wouldn't do that, but they might. Lastly, and most controversially, we have the European Union. Now, if you ask the question, does the EU challenge parliamentary sovereignty, you'll probably get a lot of different answers depending on who you speak to. What we do know is that in January 2021, the EU will in no way challenge parliamentary sovereignty. If we want to get more complicated, because it was an act of Parliament which took us into the European Union, technically we didn't give sovereignty away or have sovereignty taken away, but we actually loaned it out. You'll see that there's a reference here to sovereignty being pooled and not lost. So it's the European Union is an environment, it is argued, in which France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK retained their individuality whilst working collectively. So they didn't lose their sovereignty, they just lumped it all together and they could take it back whenever they wanted. If we can get even more complicated than that, because I mean, there's no consensus about this at all, basically. Some people have actually argued that sovereignty has been gained through the European Union because the UK has a louder voice on the world stage. Other people have argued that we lost sovereignty because we surrendered to Brussels all of our ancient lawmaking rights and privileges. And a third group of people have argued that sovereignty was preserved because whilst we agreed to certain European Union laws and regulations, we opted out of big significant ones like joining the Euro or the Schengen Agreement. One area where there's no disagreement, though, is that when there is a clash between something that the European Union says should happen and something that the UK says should happen, the European Union wins out, and it will win out until January 2021. The key event here, I think we've mentioned it already, but if not, it was the Factor Tame case of 1988. British fishing grounds, the area of the sea a certain number of miles off the coast of the UK, had basically just been the preserve of British fishermen. But then foreign fishing fleets, particularly those from Spain, argued that as the European community, as was then, as the European community was sort of one big entity, anybody could fish anywhere. And the UK said, no, these are our areas for fishing only. And the EU, or sorry, the EC, looked at it and said, actually, no, the Spanish fishermen have got a point. So the UK lost out there. So what the UK wanted to happen, what the EU wanted to happen, were in conflict, and EU law wins out. And that would always happen, or will always happen, until January 2021. Another point I just want to quickly make here is that you often hear references to sovereignty being eroded. But I want to send out a warning there. Sovereignty being eroded is a bit of an imprecise term. When you erode something, it gets smaller and smaller because parts of it vanish. Sovereignty in the UK doesn't disappear. Okay, you can't erode sovereignty. You can give it away and take it back. You can loan it out. You can redistribute it. But there's still the same amount of sovereignty. It's just who possesses it. Sovereignty in the UK doesn't vanish. The UK will get some back next year. Parliament will get some back next year, but because of the departure from the EU and the transition period. But it's given up some to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and London. If in the future, and London being the Greater London Authority, not Westminster. If in the future we rejoin the European Union, we will reallocate some sovereignty and loan some to Brussels. If you think of sovereignty as being something that can be solid and eroded, it doesn't really work. Okay, finally, is Parliament sovereign then? Or do these arguments convince? Well, this question is for another time. Really, it's for 2 other times. The next 2 lessons are going to be me talking about the arguments for and against Parliament being sovereign. For now, you pause until next lesson. And you start mulling over in your minds, what are the arguments for and against Parliament being sovereign? We've looked at this from a sort of abstract way to do the EU and other institutions and whatever. We also need to consider it from within Parliament. Is it Parliament that's sovereign, or is it executive sovereignty? Let me know how that goes. If that was terrible, email me and let me know. It's probably too late to stop me doing the next 2 like this, but you never can tell. Thank you. Bye-bye.